Mr. Nelson.
Thank you, Your Honor, at this time the defense rests.
Thank you. Mr. Blackwell, does the state have rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Good morning, Your Honor, counsel, ladies and gentlemen. The state will recall to the stand Dr. Martin Tobin. In just one moment, Your Honor.
Not a problem. Tobin, since we are recalling you, I'm going to swear you in again. Yep. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
You have a seat again. And just for the record, if you could restate your name and if you feel comfortable, take the mask off.
Okay. My name is Martin Tobin.
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Tobin.
Mr. Blackwell?
Thank you for rejoining us. Got just a few follow-up questions to ask you in rebuttal. But first, just so you're introduced to the jury, you're a pulmonologist.
Correct. Lung specialist. Yeah.
Critical care physician.
Yeah, intensive care doctor.
And you studied the physiology of breathing for 46 years.
Correct. Yeah.
I want to first ask you about the issue of Mr. Floyd's potential exposure to carbon monoxide.
Yes.
Were you able to hear testimony regarding this yesterday?
Yes, I was.
Were you able to see this particular slide in the highlighted statement at the bottom? In 7 minutes, Mr. Floyd's carboxyhemoglobin could have increased by 10 to 18%.
Correct. Yeah, I saw that.
Would you first just tell us right off the bat, do you agree with that proposition that's highlighted there?
No, I do not.
Now, would you tell us what carboxyhemoglobin is?
Yeah, carboxyhemoglobin is when the carbon monoxide combines with the protein in a blood that's called the hemoglobin. And so it's the combination of the carbon monoxide and that protein in the blood.
And why is carboxyhemoglobin, again, important?
It's important because when the carbon monoxide binds to the hemoglobin, it displaces the oxygen off the hemoglobin. So you need the oxygen on the hemoglobin. You don't want the carboxy in it. It takes it over.
Then do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether this statement that Mr. Floyd's carboxyhemoglobin could have increased by 10 to 18% is reliable?
No, I believe it is not reliable.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen why that statement is not reliable?
I base it on the arterial blood gas that was obtained when Mr. Floyd was in Hennepin County.
Please, sidebar.
So have to keep in mind as this testimony goes that they really have to avoid certain parts with this testimony to avoid a mistrial, obviously. And Eric Nelson, I'm sure, is taking every chance to jump in with an objection if in his opinion it gets close to something that's not allowed with this testimony. So something to listen for as this testimony continues.
think the objection should be sustained, but just rephrase the question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Tobin, as you prepare to tell us why these results, in your opinion, are not reliable, could you please help the jury to understand something about oxygen saturation testing in the blood?
Right. So if you have, like was done in Mr. Floyd when he went to Hennepin County, he had an arterial blood gas obtained. So that's sticking a needle into the artery at the wrist, and you take out the blood. And then on the blood gas measurements, you measure a number of different items on that, like the pressure of oxygen in the blood, the pressure of carbon dioxide, the amount of acid in the blood, called the pH. And you get all these different measurements, and you also get the oxygen saturation, and that is how much of the hemoglobin, the protein in the blood that carries the oxygen, how much of that hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen. And we know in Mr. Floyd that it was 98% saturated.
So 98% saturated with oxygen?
With oxygen when they measured it in Hennepin County. And
So
that was 9/16, the time frame.
So if we know that there's an oxygen saturation of 98%, does that tell us anything whatsoever?
Yes,
about what?
I'm sorry, I interrupt. I apologize.
Does that tell us anything whatsoever about what the carbon monoxide content could have been at a maximum in?
Yes, it does. It tells us that if the hemoglobin is saturated at 98%, it tells you all there was for everything else is 2%, and so the maximum amount of carbon monoxide would be 2%. It tells you the maximum amount of carboxyhemoglobin. That was what was mentioned yesterday. The maximum amount is 2%. It doesn't even tell you that it is 2%. It could be something else. But 2% of carboxyhemoglobin is within the normal range. You and I have levels of carboxyhemoglobin of somewhere between 0 and 3.
And so in other words, as to the statement that his carboxyhemoglobin could have increased by 10 to 18%, in your view, that's not possible.
It's simply wrong.
And it was at most 2%.
At most 2%.
Normal.
Which is normal.
New subject to discuss with you. You might recall, if you were listening to the testimony, my discussing with Dr. Fowler the hypopharynx.
Yes, I remember.
And you might recall I spent some time asking him about what research he had done on the potential for pressure on the back to narrow the hypopharynx.
Yeah, I recall that.
Do you recall him saying he had canvassed the literature and he could not find anything?
I'm sorry?
Do you recall him saying he had reviewed the research and that he could not find anything?
Yes, I recall him saying that.
Are you able to enlighten or give any information to the jury on the nature of the research on the hypopharynx and how it narrows with compression in the prone position?
Yeah. So, the research on this, which is extensive, is really in the scientific literature. It's in the physiological literature. And then that is applied over to clinical medicine. So the type of studies that are done are not really done in terms of ordinary clinical research. It's much more a physiological, much more scientific of how the body works. And there's about probably at least a dozen, maybe 20 studies that show the relationship between how that if you lower the size of the lungs, you must get a decrease in the size of the hypopharynx. All of the studies show that.
And then are there studies then that look at whether the pressure on the neck narrows the hypopharynx?
No. Because when we do research, we try and do research on studies that might be puzzling, that you would be kind of expecting a bit of a surprise. If you think about sticking your fingers into your neck, you know you're going to narrow the hypopharynx. That's not kind of research that somebody is going to want to do. It's so common sense that you would know that that's going to happen. I mean, you can do it on yourself if you want. And as soon as you put pressure here, you can immediately sense that your upper airway is narrowing.
Dr. Tobin, that is all we wanted to clarify with you this morning.
Okay.
Any comments? If I may have 2 minutes.
Sure. Let's do a stretch break in place.
Okay, Lou, so Judge Cahill just said they're doing a stretch break in place.
I think he just said that because the attorneys are talking with each other and trying to figure out if there's anything else that they should ask before this witness is off the stand. And I think that once he's off the stand, then this case is over. And, you know, there may not be a whole lot more happening in the courtroom the rest of the day here. And closing arguments, as the judge said before, were scheduled for Monday. So they were careful with their questioning, as the judge told them they had to be. They're probably figuring out what else they need to ask him before they let him go, and then we'll go from there.
All right, so let's continue to listen in, but really short time on the stand today for Dr. Tobin.
Yeah, and I guess the cross-examination from Eric Nelson hasn't happened yet. I should have mentioned that. So, but again, it's a very narrow scope of testimony, and Nelson is at a little bit of a disadvantage. He mentioned this morning that his medical expert is on a plane right now, Dr. Fowler, so he couldn't contact him to run this stuff by him prior. You know, they said that this disclosure came from the state at 8 a.m. And so without having run all this by his expert and, you know, what kind of things to ask in cross-examination after Tobin gets up like this in rebuttal, you know, it just depends on how much planning they did last night, I guess.
Right. And those things happen, Lou, where, you know, if you're getting a witness from a different state and they're flying, I mean, logistically, you just can't have them there to ask questions. Yeah,
experts are allowed to watch testimony. So in other cases, I've seen the witness or the expert witness sitting right behind the lawyers for the rest of the trial after their testimony. But yeah, these paid witnesses, you know, are getting paid for their time, and apparently Dr. Fowler's time was up, and he's heading back home.
Yeah, and Lou, I don't know if we have time while they're doing this stretch break, but can we just talk a little bit about what Tobin did testify about in this rebuttal? Yeah, so when Judge Cahill said that he could testify about environmental factors, he's not talking about like the environment per se, but just the factors involving carbon monoxide that may have affected George Floyd. And he did go to some evidence that was already in, which was the hemoglobin saturation. And you heard Dr. Tobin testify that if the hemoglobin is saturated at 98% oxygen is what he meant, then the maximum amount of carbon monoxide would be 2%. And he said that wouldn't be a factor. And so it's just basically tamping down possible doubt that may have been raised by Dr. Fowler's testimony yesterday when it came to the carbon monoxide. And I could say, as far as our viewers go, I mean, you know, I don't know if this is at what level of doubt this would raise to, but we did get a lot of notes from people wondering, oh, I was wondering about carbon monoxide and stuff like that. So it was definitely a point of interest, if nothing else, yesterday when that came up. Yeah, pretty interesting. And then he also talked about there was research over the narrowing of the hypopharynx. Yes, Dr. Fowler kind of testified yesterday in opposition to what Dr. Tobin was talking about, and it goes back to that whole feel your throat, feel your own neck, and you can feel when there's compression that it closes your windpipe. And so he basically was reiterating again, hey, remember when I had you all feel your necks during my testimony, and you could feel yourself that you couldn't breathe? Yeah. It makes it, he's just disputing
what was disputed yesterday, I guess.
Yeah, and it's pretty interesting. I mean, Judge Cahill even talked about it earlier before they brought Dr. Tobin in, but he said, you know, he's a pulmonologist. Why would you have him testify about, you know, something that he's not necessarily in? But the prosecution saying, well, I mean, it's all kind of connected, this medical stuff. So it is interesting, though, because he has been kind of a star witness in this case.
We're going to actually have a recess now until 1:45, so we'll reconvene at that time.